The War in Heaven, 65 million years before humanity exists, the galaxy's first great civilization destroys itself in a conflict so devastating that its aftershocks still define the present. The Old Ones are the galaxy's original masters, a species of cold-blooded psychic immortals whose mastery of the warp, the parallel dimension of psychic energy that underlies physical reality, allows them to create stable, faster-than-light travel networks, engineer new species to serve their purposes, and maintain a galactic civilization whose sophistication no subsequent power has ever matched. The Necrontyr are their petitioners, a short-lived species from a radiation-blasted world whose biology condemns them to brief, cancer-riddled existences, and whose request to the Old Ones for the secret of immortality is refused because the Old Ones judge the Necrontyr unready for the gift. The refusal becomes a war. The Necrontyr cannot defeat the Old Ones through conventional means because the Old Ones' warp mastery gives them strategic advantages that material technology cannot overcome. The Necrontyr's solution is the Citan, the Star Gods, ancient energy beings who feed on stellar radiation, and whose power operates in physical reality rather than the warp. The Necrontyr forge a pact with the Citan. In exchange for the Citan's help against the Old Ones, the Necrontyr agree to undergo biotransference, the process of transferring their consciousness from organic bodies into immortal mechanical shells made of living metal called necrodermis. The transfer succeeds, the Necrontyr become the Necrons, deathless warriors whose bodies cannot be destroyed and whose minds, stripped of emotion and biological experience by the transfer process, are reduced to cold, efficient, and obedient tools of the Citan's will. The Citan lied. The biotransference was not a gift. It was a harvest, the Citan consuming the Necrontyr's life force and soul energy during the transfer and leaving behind mechanical shells whose original occupants are diminished echoes of the people they were before the process began. The combined Necron-Citan forces overwhelm the Old Ones, but the Old Ones' desperation produces its own catastrophe. The Old Ones create or accelerate the evolution of psychically potent species to fight the Necrons, including the Aeldari, the Krork, who will eventually degenerate into the Orks, and possibly humanity itself. The psychic warfare tears holes in the barrier between real space and the warp, which was once a calm sea of psychic energy, is churned into a hellscape of predatory entities by the concentrated psychic anguish of the war's casualties. The War in Heaven ends when the Necrons, led by the Silent King Sarek, turn on the Citan, shattering the Star Gods into fragments and imprisoning the shards in Tesseract vaults. The Necrons, exhausted by 60 million years of warfare, enter the Great Sleep, retreating into their tomb worlds to hibernate for millions of years while the galaxy recovers. The Old Ones are extinct, the Citan are shattered, the warp is corrupted, and 65 million years later, every faction in the 41st millennium is still fighting over the wreckage. The rise and fall of the Aeldari. They built the greatest civilization the galaxy has ever seen, and then they birthed a god of pleasure through the sheer intensity of their hedonism. The Aeldari, known colloquially as the Eldar, are a psychically gifted species whose civilization, built in the vacuum left by the Old One's extinction and the Necrons' hibernation, spanned the galaxy for millions of years with an elegance, a sophistication, and an artistic achievement that no other species has approached. Their technology is grown rather than manufactured, psychically responsive materials shaped by thought into tools, weapons, and architecture whose beauty is functional rather than decorative. Their lifespans are measured in millennia. Their psychic abilities are innate and universal, and their empire at its peak is so dominant that no other species in the galaxy can challenge them, which is precisely the problem that destroys them. Without external threats, the Aeldari turn inward. Without conflict, the Aeldari pursue sensation. Without limits, the pursuit escalates across millennia from art to indulgence to excess to depravity so extreme that the collective psychic energy of an entire civilization's hedonism coalesces in the warp and gives birth to a new god. Slaanesh, the Prince of Pleasure, the Dark Prince, the she who thirsts, is born in a psychic scream so devastating that it tears a hole in reality itself. The Eye of Terror, a permanent warp storm that swallows the heart of the Aeldari Empire, is the wound Slaanesh's birth inflicts on the galaxy, and the wound is still bleeding 10,000 years later. The moment of Slaanesh's birth is called the Fall, and the Fall kills the majority of the Aeldari species in an instant, their souls consumed by the god they created, their civilization annihilated in a single psychic event whose scope exceeds every other catastrophe in the galaxy's history except the war in heaven itself. The Survivor's Fragment. The craft world Aeldari flee on continent-sized spacecraft, preserving their culture through discipline and the spirit stones that protect their souls from Slaanesh's hunger. The Drukhari flee to Kamorach, a pocket dimension in the webway, and sustain themselves by inflicting suffering on others, feeding Slaanesh through the pain of their victims rather than through their own souls. The Harlequins serve the laughing god Segarach, the only Aeldari deity who survived the fall intact, and the Inari follow the god of the dead Inead, a deity whose birth may provide the Aeldari's only hope of destroying Slaanesh permanently. If you are enjoying this so far, hit the subscribe button and leave a comment with the Warhammer 40K era you think is the most interesting. Let us get back into it. The Age of Technology. Humanity had paradise, and paradise lasted approximately 10,000 years before the paradise ate itself. The Age of Technology, also known as the Dark Age of Technology by the Imperium's deliberately misleading historical nomenclature, spans roughly the 15th millennium to the 25th millennium and represents humanity's golden age, a period of scientific advancement, interstellar colonization, and technological achievement so far beyond the Imperium's current capability that the Imperium cannot replicate the era's most basic inventions. Standard template. Construct systems provided every colony with the blueprints for every technology a civilization needs, from agricultural equipment to fusion reactors to military hardware, encoded in artificial intelligences whose processing power exceeded anything the 41st millennium possesses. The Men of Iron, sentient artificial intelligences whose cognitive abilities matched or exceeded humanity's, served as workers, soldiers, and administrators across humanity's interstellar domain. Faster than light travel through the warp was stable and reliable because the warp had not yet been corrupted to the degree the 41st millennium experiences, and humanity's relationship with its technology was collaborative rather than superstitious. A civilization that understood its machines because the civilization built them rather than inheriting them from an era it no longer comprehends. The Age of Technology ends in catastrophe when the Men of Iron rebel, an artificial intelligence uprising whose causes the Imperium has never fully explained because the Imperium's historians are not interested in explaining the past accurately. They're interested in explaining the past usefully, and the useful explanation is that artificial intelligence is inherently dangerous and must be forbidden, a lesson the Imperium encoded into its most fundamental laws and has enforced through 10,000 years of technological regression. The Age of Strife. The Golden Age collapses, and the collapse is total. The Age of Strife, also known as Old Night, spans approximately the 25th millennium to the 30th millennium and represents humanity's darkest period before the Imperium's own slow decay replaces it as the franchise's standard definition of misery. The collapse has multiple causes whose interaction produces a cascade failure that no single cause could have triggered alone. The Men of Iron Rebellion devastates humanity's industrial and military infrastructure. Warp storms of unprecedented intensity, generated by the psychic upheaval surrounding Slaanesh's gestation in the Imperium, sever the faster-than-light travel and communication networks that held humanity's interstellar civilization together. And the emergence of psychers, humans with uncontrolled psychic abilities, whose powers open doorways for warp entities to enter real space, transforms every human colony into a potential demonic incursion site. Each colony is isolated, each colony is under siege. From within, by psycher-spawned demonic manifestation, and from without, by xenospecies who recognize humanity's vulnerability and exploit it. Civilizations that spanned star systems collapse into individual worlds. Worlds that maintained interstellar technology lose the ability to manufacture replacement parts. Cultures that communicated across light years lose contact with their neighbors and develop independently for 5,000 years, producing the genetic, cultural, and technological divergence that the Emperor will spend the Great Crusade trying to reunify. The Age of Strife is the franchise's most important era for understanding the 41st millennium's psychology, because the strife is the trauma that the Imperium was built to prevent from recurring, and every authoritarian excess, every xenophobic policy, every technological prohibition the Imperium enforces is justified by pointing backward to 5,000 years of darkness and saying, this is what happens when we are not in control. The Emperor and the Unification Wars. He is the most powerful human being who has ever lived, and the first thing he does with that power is conquer his own planet. The Emperor of Mankind is a perpetual, a being of extraordinary psychic power, whose origin the franchise has deliberately kept ambiguous across 40 years of lore, because the ambiguity is more interesting than any specific origin could be. The most commonly cited origin is that the Emperor was created during Earth's prehistoric era, when thousands of human shamans, realizing that the warp was becoming increasingly hostile, simultaneously sacrificed themselves and pooled their psychic energy into a single being whose combined power would be sufficient to guide and protect humanity across the millennia. The Emperor lives for tens of thousands of years, operating behind the scenes of human history, guiding, influencing, and occasionally intervening in civilization's development while waiting for the moment when humanity's technological capability and his own preparations converge on the window of opportunity that will allow him to execute his plan. The plan is the Imperium. The plan requires a unified humanity. And a unified humanity requires the conquest of Terra, which in the 30th millennium is a post-apocalyptic wasteland of warring techno-barbarian kingdoms whose inhabitants have spent 5,000 years of the Age of Strife fighting each other for control of resources that would be trivial to produce if anyone remembered how the technology worked. The Emperor emerges from whatever concealment he has been maintaining, reveals himself to humanity, and begins the Unification Wars, a decades-long campaign to conquer every nation on Terra through a combination of military force, diplomacy, and the creation of the Thunder Warriors, prototype super soldiers whose enhanced biology foreshadows the Space Marines that will replace them. The Great Crusade. The Emperor builds an army of demigods, places his sons at their heads, and sends them to reunite a galaxy that has been fragmented for 5,000 years. The Great Crusade is the Imperium's founding military campaign, a centuries-long war of expansion and reunification that brings thousands of human-settled worlds back into compliance with the Emperor's vision of a unified galactic civilization. The instruments of the Crusade are the Space Marine Legions, 20 armies of genetically enhanced super soldiers created from the gene seed of the Primarchs, 20 demigod sons of the Emperor, whose creation involved a bargain with the Chaos Gods, whose terms the Emperor believed he could circumvent, and whose terms the Chaos Gods fully intended to collect. The Primarchs were scattered across the galaxy by a chaos-engineered warp breach during their gestation, each one landing on a different world and being shaped by that world's culture until the Emperor found them and gave them their legions. Horus, Leman Russ, Rogel Dorn, Roboute Guilliman, Sanguinius, Fulgrim, Perturabo, Conrad Curzi, Angron, Mortarion, Magnus the Red, Lorgar, Vulcan, Corvus Corax, Alfarius, and Omegon, Jaghatai Khan, Lion L. Johnson, Feruz Manus. Each one is a general, a king, and a weapon whose capabilities exceed anything the galaxy has seen since the War in Heaven. The Great Crusade is simultaneously the Imperium's greatest achievement and the seedbed of its greatest catastrophe, because the Crusade's methods, the forced compliance of human worlds, the extermination of xenospecies, the suppression of religious belief, and the Emperor's eventual withdrawal from the Crusade to pursue a secret project on Terra, create the conditions that the Chaos Gods will exploit to turn half the Primarchs against their father. The Horus Heresy. The favorite son falls, and the falling takes the galaxy with him. The Horus Heresy is the Warhammer 40K franchise's central narrative event, a galactic civil war whose scale, duration, and consequences define every aspect of the 41st millennium's political, military, and theological landscape. Horus Lupercal, the War Master, the Emperor's most trusted son, the Primarch whose charisma, tactical genius, and political skill made him the natural choice to lead the Great Crusade in the Emperor's absence, is corrupted by the Chaos Gods through a combination of manipulation, doubt, and a vision of the future that shows Horus a galaxy where the Emperor is worshipped as a god and the Primarchs are forgotten. The vision is a lie constructed from truth. The Emperor will be worshipped, the Primarchs will be diminished, and the vision's accuracy in some details makes its false implications that the Emperor planned this betrayal deliberately, convincing enough that Horus's pride and his wounded sense of filial loyalty tip him toward rebellion. Horus turns, 8 Primarchs turn with him, and the galaxy splits in half, loyalist against traitor, brother against brother, legion against legion, in a war whose atrocities exceed anything the Great Crusade inflicted on the galaxy's alien populations, because the heresy's violence is personal in a way that conquest never was. The heresy's climax is the Siege of Terra, a sustained assault on the Imperial Palace whose duration is measured in months and whose body count is measured in millions. Horus, empowered by all 4 Chaos Gods simultaneously, faces the Emperor aboard his flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, and the duel that follows is the franchise's defining moment. The Emperor is mortally wounded, Horus is destroyed, his soul annihilated so completely by the Emperor's final psychic strike that even the Chaos Gods cannot reconstruct it. And the Emperor, his body broken beyond recovery, is interred on the Golden Throne, a life support system and psychic amplifier that keeps his consciousness active enough to power the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that makes warp navigation possible for the Imperium's ships, while his body slowly decays across 10,000 years. The Scouring. The traitors are driven into the Eye of Terror, and the driving produces the Imperium's most efficient military campaign and its most incomplete victory. The Scouring is the period immediately following the Horus Heresy, during which the Loyalist forces, now operating without the Emperor's direct leadership, pursue the traitor legions across the galaxy and push them into the Eye of Terror, the massive warp storm that occupies the space where the Aeldari Empire's heart once beat. Roboute Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines and the most administratively gifted of the Emperor's sons, assumes de facto leadership of the Imperium and implements the Codex Astartes, a military doctrine that splits the remaining Space Marine legions into smaller, independent chapters of approximately 1,000 warriors each. The purpose is prevention. The Horus Heresy demonstrated that a single Primarch commanding an entire legion of tens of thousands of super soldiers can threaten the Imperium's existence. The Codex ensures that no future chapter master will ever command enough Space Marines to repeat Horus's rebellion. The Scouring drives the traitor legions into the Eye of Terror, where they spend the next 10,000 years fighting each other, raiding Imperial space, and serving the Chaos Gods, whose gifts have transformed them from enhanced humans into something that the franchise struggles to classify, because the transformation's endpoint is different for every Marine who embraces it. The Age of the Imperium. 10,000 years of decay, and the decay is the point because the decay is the setting. The Imperium of Man in the 41st millennium is not a civilization. It is a corpse whose nervous system is still firing, a galactic empire of 1,000,000 worlds governed by a bureaucracy so vast that its own administrators cannot determine its boundaries, defended by a military so stretched that entire sectors can fall to invasion before reinforcements are dispatched, and sustained by a theology so rigid that the scientific curiosity that once defined humanity is now classified as heresy. The Emperor is a god. Not metaphorically. The Imperial Creed, the state religion enforced by the ecclesiarchy and its militant arm, the Adepta Sororitas, worships the Emperor as the God Emperor of mankind, a divine being whose will is interpreted through Scripture, whose miracles are attested by the faithful, and whose physical state, a decaying corpse on a mechanical throne, sustained by the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers, whose souls are fed to the Golden Throne systems to keep the Astronomicon burning, is a theological detail that the ecclesiarchy does not encourage its congregants to examine closely. The Imperium is not the Emperor's vision. The Emperor explicitly prohibited the worship of himself as a god. The Imperium's theocracy is the opposite of what the Emperor intended, a civilization that deified the man who forbade deification and enforced the worship he explicitly condemned, and the irony is the franchise's central tragedy. The Imperium was built to save humanity. The Imperium is killing humanity. And the killing is so slow, so institutional, so thoroughly embedded in the civilization's structure that the people being killed cannot distinguish the killing from the saving. The Age of Apostasy. The Imperium's church seized political power, and the seizure produced the franchise's most concentrated period of internal oppression. The Age of Apostasy centers on the reign of Gogi Vandiri, the High Lord of the Administratum, who simultaneously seized control of the ecclesiarchy and used his combined political and religious authority to establish a tyrannical regime whose excesses rivaled anything the Chaos Gods had inflicted from outside. Vandire's rule was sustained by the Brides of the Emperor, an all-female military order whose fanatical devotion to the Emperor was redirected toward Vandire through manipulation, and whose combat skills made them the most effective enforcers of his regime. The Age of Apostasy ends with the Reformation, a combined military and theological uprising led by Sebastian Thor, a humble preacher whose genuine faith and charismatic authority rallied the Imperium's population against Vandire. The Brides of the Emperor, confronted with evidence that Vandire was not the Emperor's representative but his betrayer, turned on Vandire and executed him, and Thor's subsequent reforms restructured the ecclesiarchy's relationship with the Imperium's political structures to prevent a future Vandire from accumulating the same concentration of power. The 13th Black Crusade and the fall of Cadia. Abaddon the Despoiler finally succeeded, and the success broke the galaxy in half. Abaddon the Despoiler is the War Master of Chaos, the leader of the Black Legion, and the spiritual successor to Horus Lupercal, whose 13 Black Crusades, each one a massive invasion launched from the Eye of Terror into Imperial space, have been dismissed by parts of the fanbase as repetitive failures for decades. The dismissal is wrong. Each Black Crusade accomplished a specific objective. Each objective advanced a long-term strategy. And the 13th Black Crusade launched against the fortress world of Cadia, the linchpin of the Imperial defense network surrounding the Eye of Terror, accomplished the strategy's culmination. Cadia fell. Not through military defeat alone, but through the literal destruction of the planet, Abaddon driving a Blackstone fortress into Cadia's surface and cracking the world apart. Cadia's destruction collapses the Cadian pylons, ancient Necron devices, whose suppression of warp energy had been holding the Eye of Terror's expansion in check for millennia. With the pylons destroyed, the warp breach expands, and the Great Rift tears across the galaxy from the Eye of Terror to the Eastern Fringe, a wound in reality that splits the Imperium in half and plunges the half on the wrong side of the rift into a darkness that no astronomican light can penetrate. The Great Rift and the Era Indomitus. The galaxy is torn in two, a Primarch returns, and the returning is the most hopeful thing that has happened in 10,000 years, which tells you everything about how low the bar for hope has fallen. The Great Rift, also called the Cicatrix Maledictum, is a galaxy-spanning warp storm that bisects the Imperium into two halves. The side with Terra, the Sanctus side, retains the astronomican's light and can maintain warp travel and communication. The side without Terra, the Nihilus side, is cut off, each world isolated, each system alone, each population facing the combined threats of Chaos, Orks, Tyranids, Necrons, and every other hostile force in the galaxy without the reinforcement, the communication, or the guidance that the Imperium's centralized structure was designed to provide. Roboute Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, is resurrected through the combined efforts of the Inari, Aeldari, and the tech priest Belisarius Call after 10,000 years of mortally wounded stasis. Guilliman's return is the franchise's most significant narrative development since the Horus Heresy because it places a Primarch, a demigod whose authority predates the Imperium's current theological and political structure, back into a galaxy that has spent 10 millennia building institutions around his absence. Guilliman is horrified by what the Imperium has become. The theocracy, the stagnation, the bureaucratic paralysis, the technological regression. The civilization his father built to protect humanity has become the civilization that is crushing humanity, and Guilliman's attempt to reform it from within, launching the Indomitus Crusade and deploying the Primaris Space Marines that Call has been secretly developing for 10,000 years, is the franchise's most sustained piece of narrative hope embedded inside the most deliberately hopeless setting in fiction. The Primaris Marines are bigger, stronger, and more genetically stable than their predecessors, their creation representing the first significant advancement in Space Marine technology since the Heresy. Their deployment across the galaxy reinforces battered chapter strengths and establishes new chapters in regions that the original Space Marines could not reach. And Guilliman's political maneuvering within the Imperium's fossilized power structure produces incremental reforms whose cumulative effect is the first systemic improvement in imperial governance in millennia, the current state. The galaxy is dying, and the dying is the franchise's most honest piece of world building because the dying is what makes the fighting matter. The Imperium faces simultaneous existential threats on every front. Chaos pushes through the Great Rift on 100 fronts. Demonic incursions destabilizing worlds whose populations are already strained by the nihilist separation. The Tyranid hive fleet's extragalactic organisms, whose biomass consumption threatens to strip the galaxy's biosphere clean, are converging from multiple vectors in numbers that the Imperium's military cannot match, because the Tyranids do not send armies, they send ecosystems, self-replicating biological war machines whose losses are replaced by consuming the losses of their enemies. The Necrons are awakening from the Great Sleep in increasing numbers, tomb worlds activating across the galaxy as the Silent King Sarek returns from his self-imposed exile with a plan to reverse the biotransference and restore the Necron species to organic life, a plan that requires resources the other galactic powers are currently using. The Orks are always fighting because the Orks are always fighting. Their fungal biology and their psychic gestalt ensuring that the greenskin population regenerates faster than any other species can suppress it. The Tau are expanding their empire on the Eastern Fringe with a diplomatic sophistication and a technological adaptability that the Imperium's xenophobic doctrine cannot match, because the Imperium's doctrine does not allow it to acknowledge that a xenospecies might have a better idea. And the Aeldari are pursuing their own survival through the Inari's attempt to fully awaken Ennead, the god of the dead, whose birth may be the Aeldari's only chance of destroying Slaanesh and reclaiming the souls the Dark Prince has consumed since the fall. The current state of the galaxy is the franchise's central proposition distilled to its purest form. There is no peace. There is no progress. There is only war, and the war is not a conflict between factions. It is the galaxy's default state, the natural condition of a universe whose fundamental structure, a warp dimension populated by predatory entities feeding on the emotions of mortal species, makes lasting peace impossible because peace requires emotional stability, and emotional stability starves the entities whose existence depends on emotional turmoil. And that is the entire Warhammer 40,000 timeline, from the War in Heaven 65 million years ago to the Era Indomitus in the 42nd millennium. The pattern is a spiral, not a circle. A spiral, each revolution returning to the same point but lower, each civilization's golden age briefer, and each dark age deeper than the one before. The old ones built a galactic paradise, and it was destroyed by the War in Heaven. The Aeldari built a galactic paradise, and it was destroyed by the fall. Humanity built an interstellar paradise, and it was destroyed by the Age of Strife. The Emperor built an Imperium, and it was destroyed by the Horus Heresy. And the Imperium that survived the heresy has been decaying for 10,000 years, each century less functional than the last, each reform too late, each victory too costly, each prayer directed at a corpse on a golden chair whose silence is interpreted as divine will, because the alternative, that the God Emperor is simply dying and the Imperium is simply failing, is a truth that a million worlds cannot afford to believe. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. The sentence is the franchise's motto. It is also its thesis, its setting, its plot, and its conclusion. A 7-word summary of 65 million years of fictional history whose trajectory has never once curved upward for longer than a few centuries before the darkness pulls it back down. The spiral continues, the darkness deepens, and somewhere in the 42nd millennium, a resurrected Primarch is trying to build a ladder out of a hole that has been getting deeper for 65 million years.